The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the massive windows of Atlanta International Airport as Mr. Thompson, an 82-year-old retired Air Force veteran, wheeled his small carry-on bag through the bustling terminal. Despite his age, he moved with the confidence and purpose that came from decades of military service, his carefully pressed navy blue blazer adorned with medals that told stories of sacrifice and dedication to his country. He had always believed in being early, a habit ingrained during his 30 years of service. Today was no different. He'd arrived 3 hours before his flight to Seattle, where his grandchildren were eagerly awaiting their grandfather's visit. His youngest granddaughter had just started walking, and he couldn't wait to see her first steps in person instead of through a phone screen. As he made his way to the check-in counter, he couldn't help but notice the subtle reactions of people around him. Some quickly averted their eyes when he looked their way, while others whispered behind their hands to their companions. Mr. Thompson had seen these looks before. They were nothing new to him. He adjusted his collar, making sure his pilot wings pin sat straight, a reminder of the thousands of hours he'd spent in the sky serving his country. The terminal was getting busier now, filled with the morning rush of business travelers in their suits and families heading off on adventures. Mr. Thompson smiled at a young boy who was staring openly at his medals, giving him a friendly wink that made the child beam with excitement. The boy's mother quickly pulled him along, muttering apologies, but Mr. Thompson just shook his head with a kind smile. Children's curiosity had always been refreshing to him. They saw the medals for what they were, symbols of service, not reasons for prejudice. He approached the airline's premium check-in desk, first-class ticket in hand. He'd saved up his pension money for months to buy this ticket, wanting to travel in comfort given his arthritis. His daughter had insisted on contributing too, saying he deserved to fly in style after all those years of military transport planes. As he stood in line, he noticed a casually dressed man sitting in the coffee shop across the way, seemingly absorbed in his laptop. The man briefly looked up, meeting Mr. Thompson's eyes with a respectful nod before returning to his work. There was something different about that man's gaze. It carried none of the dismissive undertones he'd grown accustomed to. Mr. Thompson straightened his back, feeling the familiar weight of his service medals against his chest. Each one told the story of courage, of loss, of brotherhood. The Distinguished Flying Cross caught the morning light, reminding him of that stormy night over Vietnam when he'd risked everything to save his fellow airmen. He'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but how you carried yourself in the face of that treatment. He reached into his pocket, double-checking his flight documents and running his fingers over his military ID, a habit he'd developed over years of facing unnecessary scrutiny. The Seattle weather report he printed out was tucked neatly beside them, showing a sunny weekend ahead. Perfect weather for pushing his granddaughter's stroller through the park, something he'd been looking forward to for months. Little did Mr. Thompson know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. As he approached the check-in counter, the events about to unfold would not only change his day, but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the walls of Atlanta International Airport. The quiet dignity he'd carried throughout his life was about to face yet another test, one that would have consequences nobody in that busy terminal could have predicted. In the busy terminal's coffee shop, a man in his mid-40s sat quietly observing the morning rush. Mr. Lee, the airline's CEO and majority shareholder, had developed a habit of visiting different airports unannounced. Today, dressed in worn jeans and a simple gray sweater, he looked like any other traveler taking advantage of the airport's free Wi-Fi. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he watched the daily operations of the airline he'd built from near bankruptcy into one of the country's most promising carriers. The past week had been eye-opening. He'd witnessed everything from exceptional customer service to moments that made him question whether his message of inclusive, respectful treatment was really getting through to his staff. Taking another sip of his now cold coffee, Mr. Lee thought back to his own father's struggles as an immigrant business owner in the 1980s. Those memories had shaped his management philosophy. Treat everyone with dignity, no matter their background. He'd started these undercover visits after overhearing a conversation at a family dinner about how his cousin had been treated poorly on one of his own flights. His laptop displayed various customer satisfaction reports, but he knew numbers could never tell the whole story. That's why he was here, sitting in an uncomfortable airport chair, watching real people navigate their travel experiences. He'd learned more in the past week of observation than he had in months of boardroom meetings. A group of flight attendants walked past his table, chatting about their upcoming flight to Seattle. Mr. Lee recognized one of them from a company training video. She'd been featured for her exceptional service record. He made a mental note to follow up on that flight's crew performance later. As he typed notes on his laptop, his attention was drawn to an elderly gentleman in a navy blue blazer approaching the premium check-in counter. The medals on his chest caught the morning light, and Mr. Lee found himself straightening in his chair. His own grandfather had served in the military, and he'd grown up hearing stories about the challenges veterans faced when returning home. Mr. Lee watched as the veteran adjusted his collar, noting the man's dignified bearing despite the not-so-subtle glances from other travelers. Something about the scene stirred a memory of his grandfather's words. The true measure of a business isn't in its profits, but in how it treats those who've served others. Closing his laptop partially, Mr. Lee continued to observe while appearing absorbed in his work. Years of conducting these undercover visits had taught him the art of being invisible in plain sight. His phone buzzed with messages from the corporate office, budget meetings, quarterly reports, marketing strategies, but he ignored them. Something told him to stay focused on the unfolding scene before him. The coffee shop's location offered a perfect vantage point of the check-in counters and gate area. He noticed the supple shift in the staff's demeanor as the veteran approached, their body language telling a story that their customer service smiles tried to hide. Over the years, he'd learned to read these small signs that often preceded larger issues. Mr. Lee glanced at his watch. His own flight wasn't for several hours, giving him plenty of time to observe how this situation would develop. He'd seen enough concerning interactions this week to know that sometimes the most important moments happen when people think nobody important is watching. Little did his staff know that their CEO was sitting just 30 feet away, witnessing everything with the perspective of both a business leader and a human being who understood the sting of prejudice all too well. The boarding process for Flight 2317 to Seattle began right on schedule. Mr. Thompson stood patiently in the first-class line, his boarding pass and ID ready in his weathered hands. After 30 years of military service, he'd learned that preparation was half the battle in any situation. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity. Families gathering their belongings, business travelers checking last-minute emails, and gate agents preparing for boarding. As he approached the podium, Mr. Thompson noticed the young gate agent's smile falter slightly as she glanced between his face and his first-class ticket. She looked over at her colleague, a slight frown crossing her features. "Sir," she began, her voice carrying a forced politeness, "it seems we're having a system error with your ticket." Mr. Thompson had seen this look before, the careful arrangement of words, the supple shift in body language. He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out his printed confirmation email. "I checked in earlier without any problems," he explained calmly, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had weathered many such storms. "This ticket was purchased 3 months ago." A second gate agent stepped over, speaking in hushed tones with the first. Their whispered conversation wasn't quite quiet enough to escape the ears of nearby passengers. "Maybe he's confused about the class of service," one murmured to the other, as if Mr. Thompson couldn't hear or understand them despite his clear mental acuity. "Sir," the second agent addressed him, speaking unnecessarily slowly and loudly, "we can offer you a seat in economy for this flight, or perhaps you prefer to take the next available flight where we can sort this out." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Mr. Thompson stood straighter, his military bearing more pronounced. "Young lady," he said, his voice firm but gentle, "I have my confirmation right here, along with my military ID. I've flown first class before, and I saved for months to purchase this ticket to visit my grandchildren." By now, other passengers had begun to notice the exchange. A businessman in line behind Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, looking between the agents and the elderly veteran. A young mother nearby had stopped gathering her children's toys, her attention caught by the unfolding scene. The gate agents called over their supervisor, a woman in her 30s who approached with an air of authority that seemed to dismiss Mr. Thompson's dignity entirely. "Sir, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her tone condescending. First-class tickets are quite expensive, and our system is showing some irregularities with your booking. Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out his credit card statement showing the full first-class fare payment. His hands were steady, though his heart felt heavy. "Ma'am, I understand you're doing your job, but I've provided all the necessary documentation. I'm a retired Air Force pilot with over 10,000 flight hours. I think I know how to book a proper airline ticket." The supervisor's expression hardened slightly. "Sir, we're trying to help you here. We can offer you a middle seat in economy, or you can wait for the next flight while we investigate this situation." She emphasized the word situation as if it was somehow Mr. Thompson's fault. More passengers had stopped to watch now, some pulling out their phones, others whispering among themselves. The dignity with which Mr. Thompson handled himself stood in stark contrast to the increasingly uncomfortable behavior of the airline staff. From his seat at the coffee shop, Mr. Lee continued to observe, his coffee now completely forgotten. The confrontation had transformed the gate area into an unwitting stage where prejudice and professionalism were engaged in an uncomfortable dance. Mr. Thompson stood his ground, decades of military service evident in his bearing, while the staff's thinly veiled discriminatory behavior became increasingly apparent to everyone watching. What none of them realized was that this moment would soon become a turning point, not just for Mr. Thompson or the airline staff, but for the entire company's approach to customer service and human dignity. The quiet man observing from the coffee shop was about to remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the moments when we think nobody important is watching. The tension at Gate B7 had become palpable as more passengers stopped to witness the unfolding situation. Mr. Thompson stood quietly at the counter, his military bearing unchanged despite the growing hostility from the airline staff. His medals caught the fluorescent lighting of the terminal, a silent testimony to his years of service and sacrifice. A young woman in a business suit stepped out of line, her phone discreetly recording the scene. "This isn't right," she whispered to the person next to her. "He's clearly shown them all his documentation." Others nearby nodded in agreement, their expressions showing a mix of concern and disbelief at how the situation was being handled. The supervisor's tone grew increasingly defensive as she noticed more passengers paying attention. "Sir, as I've explained, we have procedures we need to follow," she said, her voice carrying a hint of irritation. "Perhaps you're not understanding the complexity of our booking system." Mr. Thompson's response was measured, his voice steady and clear. "Young lady, I've navigated aircraft through combat zones and commanded crews larger than your entire gate staff. I understand procedures quite well." He paused, adjusting his pilot wings pin. "What I don't understand is why my valid first-class ticket is suddenly causing such confusion." A couple with 2 young children stood nearby, the parents using the moment as a teaching opportunity. "Look at his medals," the father whispered to his wide-eyed children. "Each one tells a story of service to our country." The mother nodded, making sure her kids understood the importance of what they were witnessing. The gate agents huddled together, throwing uncertain glances at the growing crowd. Their whispered conversation carried fragments of words like policy and protocol, but their body language told a different story, one of discomfort at being caught in a situation that was quickly spiraling beyond their control. An elderly woman sitting in a wheelchair near the gate spoke up, her voice carrying years of wisdom. "I remember when my late husband flew home from his service," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "He always said you could judge a society by how it treats its veterans." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mr. Thompson reached into his blazer once more, this time pulling out a worn photograph. "These are my grandchildren," he said quietly to the supervisor. "The youngest just started walking. I haven't held her since she was born, and I've been planning this trip for months." His voice remained steady, but those close enough could hear the emotion behind his words. The crowd had grown larger now, with even passengers from neighboring gates stopping to observe. Some were shaking their heads in disapproval at the staff's behavior, while others were making phone calls, describing the scene to whoever was on the other end of the line. A flight attendant preparing for boarding stood off to the side, clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. She kept glancing between Mr. Thompson and her colleagues, her expression suggesting she wanted to speak up but felt constrained by professional obligations. In the coffee shop, Mr. Lee continued his observation, his laptop now completely closed. He watched as his employees dug themselves deeper into a situation that could have been easily resolved with simple respect and professionalism. His own father's words echoed in his mind. The true test of character isn't how you treat people when everyone's watching, but how you treat them when you think nobody is. The supervisor made one last attempt to control the situation. "Sir, if you continue to insist, we'll need to call security to sort this out." Her threat, though veiled, was clear to everyone within earshot. A collective murmur of disapproval rippled through the gathered crowd. Mr. Thompson simply stood there, his posture straight, his dignity intact. He'd faced worse situations in his life, and his expression showed not anger, but a deep disappointment. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the increasingly flustered staff was striking to everyone watching. The atmosphere in the gate area had transformed from the usual pre-flight bustle into something more significant, a moment where everyday prejudice was being exposed in real time and where the power of quiet dignity was proving stronger than institutional bias. What nobody realized was that this situation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge everyone's assumptions about power, respect, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. Just as the supervisor reached for her radio to call security, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." The words came from the direction of the coffee shop, causing heads to turn. Mr. Lee stood up from his table, straightening his simple gray sweater as he walked toward the gate. The supervisor's expression shifted from confusion to shock as she recognized the man approaching. Her hand dropped from the radio and color drained from her face. The other gate agents straightened up immediately, their previous confidence evaporating as their CEO walked toward them. "I've been sitting there for the past hour," Mr. Lee said, his voice calm but firm, "watching how our customers are treated." He paused, looking at each staff member in turn. "I've seen enough." The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the scene took this unexpected turn. Mr. Lee turned to Mr. Thompson, extending his hand. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" The veteran handed over his documentation with the same dignity he displayed throughout the ordeal. The CEO examined the papers briefly, though it was clear he didn't need to. "Everything appears to be in perfect order, just as you've been saying." The supervisor started to speak. "Sir, I can explain," but Mr. Lee held up his hand. "I've heard enough explanations. I've been watching this entire situation unfold." He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the gate area. "What I've witnessed today is not what our airline stands for." A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "Mom, is that man in charge?" The innocent question brought a few nervous chuckles from the crowd, breaking the tension slightly. Mr. Lee smiled at the child before continuing. "Mr. Thompson," he said, turning back to the veteran, "on behalf of our entire airline, I want to apologize for how you've been treated today." He gestured to the first-class cabin. "Your seat is ready for you, and I would be honored to escort you aboard myself." The gate agents stood frozen, their earlier arrogance replaced by the realization that their discriminatory behavior had been witnessed by none other than their company's highest authority. The supervisor's clipboard shook slightly in her hands as the gravity of the situation sank in. An older gentleman in the crowd spoke up. "Now that's what I call leadership." Others nodded in agreement, some even breaking into spontaneous applause. Mr. Thompson remained composed, though a slight smile crossed his face, not one of triumph, but of appreciation for justice being served. Mr. Lee addressed his staff directly, his voice firm but controlled. "We'll be having a detailed discussion about this incident later. For now, I suggest you all take a moment to look at those medals on Mr. Thompson's chest. Each one represents sacrifice and service that deserves nothing but our utmost respect." The supervisor's earlier threats about security had been replaced by a mortified silence. Other airline employees who had gathered to watch quickly returned to their duties, whispering among themselves about what they'd just witnessed. A flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. "Sir," she addressed Mr. Thompson, "it would be my privilege to show you to your seat." Her genuine respect stood in stark contrast to the previous treatment he'd received. As Mr. Lee prepared to escort Mr. Thompson onto the plane, he turned one last time to address everyone present. Today has been a powerful reminder that character reveals itself in how we treat others when we think no one of consequence is watching. But there's always someone watching, if not a CEO, then our own conscience. The crowd began to disperse, many people nodding in approval at the outcome. Parents could be heard explaining the significance of what had happened to their children. Business travelers typed rapidly on their phones, likely sharing the story with colleagues and friends. The incident had transformed from a moment of discrimination into a lesson about dignity, respect, and the unexpected ways justice can prevail. What started as an ordinary morning at Gate B7 had become a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important person in the room isn't always the most obvious. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted noticeably as Mr. Lee and Mr. Thompson boarded the plane together. Other passengers watched with interest, some having witnessed the scene at the gate, others picking up on the unusual sight of the CEO personally escorting a passenger to his seat. "Right here, sir," Mr. Lee gestured to a comfortable window seat in the first row. "I believe you'll find this view particularly familiar, given your flying experience." Mr. Thompson settled into his seat, his medals catching the cabin lighting as he carefully placed his carry-on bag under the seat in front. A flight attendant approached quickly, her demeanor genuinely warm and professional. "Mr. Thompson, would you like a pre-flight beverage?" she asked, making sure he was comfortable. The contrast between this treatment and what he'd experienced moments ago at the gate wasn't lost on anyone watching. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Mr. Lee addressed the staff who had caused the incident. His voice was low but carried the weight of authority. "I want everyone involved in this situation to stay after their shift today. We're going to have a very important conversation about the future of your employment with this airline." The supervisor, still visibly shaken, attempted to defend their actions. "Sir, we were just following what we thought was protocol for suspicious bookings." Her voice trailed off as Mr. Lee held up his hand. "Protocol?" he questioned, his tone firm but measured. "Show me where in our protocol it says to discriminate against decorated veterans. Show me where it says to ignore valid documentation and treat our passengers with disrespect." The gathered staff shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his gaze. Mr. Lee pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "I need an immediate replacement crew for the gate, and please send HR representatives to meet me here in an hour." He turned back to the staff. "Today's events will lead to changes in this airline, starting right now." Back on the plane, other first-class passengers were introducing themselves to Mr. Thompson, many expressing their support and sharing their own stories. A young business executive even offered to switch seats with his colleague so a veteran's wife could sit next to Mr. Thompson during the flight. Mr. Lee returned to the aircraft, stopping in the first-class cabin. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to have this," he said, handing him a business card with a direct number written on the back. "Anytime you or any other veteran has trouble with our airline, this number will connect you directly to my office." The CEO then addressed the entire first-class cabin, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the scene you witnessed today. It's not representative of our airline's values. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all customer-facing staff, with a special focus on respecting our veterans." A quiet murmur of approval spread through the cabin. An elderly couple across the aisle smiled and nodded, the husband touching his own veteran's pin thoughtfully. The wife whispered something about finally someone doing the right thing. Mr. Lee wasn't finished. Speaking directly to the flight crew, he announced, effective immediately, our airline will be launching a new program honoring veterans. Priority boarding, lounge access, and special assistance will be available to all who've served. The flight attendants nodded enthusiastically, clearly relieved to be part of the solution rather than the problem. Before leaving the plane, Mr. Lee paused one last time beside Mr. Thompson's seat. "Sir, your experience today has opened my eyes to issues we need to address. Would you be willing to help us develop our new veterans program? Your insight would be invaluable." Mr. Thompson looked up at the CEO, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "If it helps prevent another veteran from going through what I experienced today, I'd be honored to help," he replied, his voice steady and dignified as ever. As Mr. Lee departed the aircraft, the regular boarding process resumed, but something had changed. The crew moved with renewed purpose, their interactions with passengers more genuine and respectful. They'd witnessed firsthand how quickly discrimination could be exposed and how important it was to treat every passenger with dignity. The flight attendant returned to Mr. Thompson with his requested water, along with a warm smile. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said softly, "both then and now. Your dignity today will help make things better for others." Mr. Thompson nodded in acknowledgement, looking out the window as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of promise. 3 months after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, the airline's main conference room was packed with media representatives and employees. The occasion? The launch of the Veterans Respect Initiative, a comprehensive program that had grown from one morning's confrontation into something much bigger. Mr. Thompson sat in the front row, his navy blue blazer and medals as pristine as ever. Next to him, several other veterans who'd experienced similar discrimination shared quiet conversations. They'd all become part of the airline's new advisory board, helping shape policies to prevent what had happened that morning from ever occurring again. The CEO stepped up to the podium, looking more formal than he had in his casual clothes that fateful morning. 3 months ago, I witnessed something that made me question everything about how our airline operated, he began, his voice carrying through the room. Today, we're not just launching a program, we're changing our entire culture. Screens behind him displayed statistics. Over 500 employees had already completed the new sensitivity training program. Customer satisfaction scores among veteran passengers had risen by 60%. But more importantly, stories of positive changes were pouring in from across the country. A young flight attendant stood up to share her experience. "Last week, I had a veteran on my flight who used a wheelchair," she said. "Thanks to our new training, our entire crew knew exactly how to make him comfortable and respect his dignity. The smile on his face when we thanked him for his service, that's something I'll never forget." The gate supervisor from the incident had been reassigned to help develop the training program, turning her mistake into a teaching tool. "Working with Mr. Thompson and other veterans has opened my eyes," she admitted to the audience. "I thought I knew about customer service, but I'd never truly understood the meaning of respect." Mr. Thompson was invited to speak next. As he approached the podium, every person in the room stood in respect. "What happened to me that morning was unfortunate," he began, his voice clear and strong. "But what's come from it is remarkable. This isn't just about airlines or veterans, it's about how we treat each other as human beings." The CEO then unveiled the program's centerpiece, a new priority boarding lane specifically for veterans, marked with all military branch seals. But more than these visible changes, he explained, we've changed how we train our staff. Every employee now spends time with veterans, hearing their stories, understanding their experiences. A video played on the screens showing countless positive interactions between airline staff and veteran passengers from the past 3 months. In one clip, a gate agent was seen helping an elderly veteran with his bags. In another, a flight attendant was photographed trading military stories with a young service member. The most touching moment came when a group of elementary school students took the stage. They'd been at the airport that day with their teacher, who'd turned the incident into a semester-long project about respect and dignity. The children had written letters to veterans, which would now be displayed in the airline's lounges across the country. One morning of discrimination led to 3 months of transformation, the CEO continued. But this is just the beginning. Today, we're announcing partnerships with veteran organizations across the country. Every airport we serve will have special assistance available for veteran passengers. Every employee will be trained not just in procedures, but in empathy. Mr. Thompson's grandchildren, whom he'd been traveling to see that fateful day, sat proudly watching their grandfather. The youngest one, now walking steadily, wore a tiny pin matching her grandfather's pilot wings. The CEO noticed this and smiled, reminding everyone that change affects not just the current generation, but those to come. The press conference ended with an announcement that shocked everyone. The airline would offer free first-class upgrades to veterans over 65 when seats were available. "It's not just about making things right," the CEO explained. "It's about setting an example for the entire industry." As the event concluded, Mr. Thompson stood with the CEO for photos. But more meaningful than any official picture was the candid moment captured by a photographer. The two men in quiet conversation, sharing a laugh, having turned a moment of discrimination into a catalyst for lasting change. Outside the conference room, employees gathered around a new plaque being installed in every airport terminal where the airline operated. It read, "Respect isn't just given to those who demand it, it's offered to everyone who walks through our doors. In honor of those who served, we serve with dignity."